Well, welcome to our first graders this morning. Boys and girls, good to have you with us in prayer today. We talked today, throughout the scriptures, we're invited to think about sacred places because we hear about Jesus in the synagogue, presumably the synagogue at Capernaum, where he spent a great deal of time. And we hear about the priesthood of Melchizedek of the Old Testament. Now, Melchizedek was a priest of the Israelites before there was a temple in Jerusalem. Sacrifice would have been offered at particular places on an altar in sacred ground. But we hear about sacred place and what happens in sacred places. In the temple of Jerusalem, eventually, was the place of sacrifice. In each town or village, there would have been a synagogue where the faithful would gather for prayer on the Sabbath. When they couldn't get to Jerusalem for the temple worship, the synagogue became the local affiliate, if you were, as a more regular place of prayer, a place of teaching. Jesus replaces both. Jesus is the priest forever in the line of Melchizedek that's echoed in the psalm today, and the letter to the Hebrews draws Jesus into that notion of priesthood as the offering of sacrifice. The sacred place becomes now the sacred person of Jesus. And in the synagogue, Jesus becomes master of teaching the word, not just by preaching, but by his example and his mighty deeds. He can stand before the Pharisees more boldly by giving flesh and blood to words of prayer and words of instruction by healing, and he demonstrates the presence of God. And so no longer in Jesus is there a need for the sacred place because the divine person is with them and is in fact with us. Now we too have our sacred place, but we recognize, as we've just concluded the Christmas season, that we celebrate Emmanuel, God with us. And so the church, the house of the church, the ecclesia, isn't the only dwelling place of God, but the gathering place of the people of God, where Christ is present among us as we gather together. And certainly we recognize the presence of Christ sacramentally in the Eucharist, abiding in this place. But what we recognize, what we celebrate in our faith, is not that we have to go somewhere to find God, but we give thanks that God has found us and made his dwelling among us. And grace abounds because our hearts are open. Jesus replaces all those things, and we give thanks that as we are called Christians, we are called so because we recognize the presence of Christ with us. As we act Christ-like, because Christ dwells in our hearts and makes it happen. Not that we can make it happen of ourselves, but we give thanks for what he accomplishes in us because God is with us. So give thanks today for what's manifest as a holy place because the Holy One is with us, and that each of us represents something of a bit of holiness, whoever we are, wherever we are, as we live to reflect what is taking place in our hearts.